Good morning and welcome to Lunch With. Today we're having lunch with Khatuna Tsintsadze from the Zahid Mubarak Trust. Khatuna, are you with us? Hello? Do you join us?
Hello, I'm here indeed.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a program that's been several months in the planning because we originally planned to hold it last year, and then for one reason or another we had to postpone and rearrange. So I'm really delighted that we're able to finally hold this lunch with you, Khatuna. This is actually the last in the current series of Lunch With. We're going to be taking a bit of a break over the summer to review these programs and also the last month in criminal justice programs. And those who've attended this or indeed any of the other Lunch With programs, we're going to be emailing you and just asking if you have a chance to let us tell us what you think about the series as a whole, how it's, what you've liked about it, how you think we can improve on it, and so on and so forth. And we'll be following up with some further information of that in the next few days. But just a bit about Khatuna and the Zahid Mubarak Trust that she co-directs before we get going. She's the co-director of the Zahid Mubarak Trust, a position that she's held since 2011. The trust was founded by the family of 19-year-old Zahid Mubarak, who was murdered by his racist cellmate on the morning of his release from Feltham Young Offender Institution. The trust advocates for justice and fairness across the prison system and for systematic change at a local and national level. And we'll be talking a fair bit really about the work of the Zahid Mubarak Trust, the very important work that it does during the course of this Lunch With. Those who've attended previous Lunch With know that we have the Q&A function. So if you want to pose a question to Khatuna, then please do put it in the Q&A. Don't use the chat because otherwise it just gets all a bit kind of complicated with too many different forms of communication. So put your questions in the Q&A function. If you think a question is really noteworthy, or you'd be particularly keen to hear it answered, even if it's not a question you've asked, then you can also use the upvote function to signify that you think it's an important or significant question. So without further ado, let's get on with our conversation. So Khatuna, just to start with, just tell us a little bit about the Zahid Mubarak Trust, starting indeed with who Zahid Mubarak was.
Thank you, Richard, for this wonderful introduction. I don't know how you've managed to pack everything in a few sentences so well. I just want to do a very quick shout out to everybody who is attending today. I'm really grateful, even if there is one person who gave up time to listen to me and what I have to say. I'm really grateful and I appreciate you. And I also want to give appreciation to this series. You have had wonderful guests, and being the last one, I do hope I will do some justice to this work as well. So yeah, so in terms of our history and the reason why we exist and why we do what we do is different from typical criminal justice charities. 22 years ago, 19-year-old Zahid stole a packet of razors from a shop and received a 90-day sentence to serve at Feltham Young Offenders Institution. Like many young men who are incarcerated, Zahid was remorseful for what he did. He wrote regularly to his family, and every single letter, which we still keep, speaks about his desire to change his life and promise that he will not let them down again. He was looking forward to living and was described as an exemplary prisoner by staff and other inmates. A few weeks before the release date, Zahid had been moved into a shared cell with someone because of overcrowding at Feltham. Despite of his calm and quiet nature, Zahid made a number of complaints about his cellmate having racist views and generally being not having kind of violent views also about non-white people. He was concerned and asked for help to be moved. On the morning of the release, Zahid was viciously attacked by his cellmate while sleeping and died from injuries that left him unrecognizable to his family. The Home Office originally insisted that a public inquiry was not necessary, that the prison's own investigation and the police investigation had sufficed. But Zahid's family still had not received the answer to the one main question. Why was a known racist sharing cell with Asian person despite Zahid's numerous requests? So the family, represented by Imtiaz Amin, who is now the trust co-director, got support from some incredible activists, lawyers, and organizations like the Monitoring Group. 4 years later, the inquiry was eventually granted and became known as the Zahid Mubarak Inquiry, one of its kind, described as a Stephen Lawrence moment for the prison service. It lasted for 6 months and they reported in 2006. Nigel Giffen, who was counsel for the public inquiry, in his speech commented that there were as many as 15 occasions when prison staff might have influenced the course of events if they had acted differently in response to the information they had. The inquiry altogether identified 186 missed opportunities over the period of several years leading up to this tragic event that could have saved Zahid's life if identified and acted upon by various agencies. Inquiry found no evidence that Zahid had been placed in cell with a known racist as part of alleged practice known as gladiator games. I'm sure you've heard about this, Richard, and maybe some others as well who are attending today, in which this was the practice in which two inmates who might attack each other were put together while staff bet on the outcome. However, during the inquiry and afterwards, the suggestion that to some extent such practice did occur at Feltham remained alive. Inquiry lawyers said that the fact that prison officers did not know about Zahid's cellmate's violent past when they first placed him in his cell did not excuse them leaving him there for 2 weeks after the file containing warnings arrived and it was available to them. There still remains the question, even if Zahid's cellmate was not originally placed in cell 38 at Feltham out of malice, it was out of malice that he was left there after he had been identified as dangerous and racist. Zahid Mubarak inquiry made 88 recommendations covering broad areas such as mental health, safety, effective information sharing, and race equality. In 2009, the trust was formally registered to ensure that the legacy for Zahid's short life and tragic death lives, to improve the outcomes for ethnic minority young people and people in general in the criminal justice system. And the focus on the recommendations still is the baseline of our work. So where we are, and 20 years later, we operate the largest spatialist project led by and focused on ethnic minority people across 40 prisons in England and Wales. That's our external scrutiny and support project, which is our flagship program since 2010. And we also are involved in a number of high-level advisory groups, which provide us with the opportunity to influence the policy development. Hope that answers your question, and we can cover a bit more later on.
I mean, that's a very, very full question, and I think, answer rather, and I think you cover an awful amount of ground there. And I'm really struck, I mean, I think that whole question about, the so-called gladiator contest, which, one of the allegations have been floating around for some years, actually, and it's, really, I mean, we anybody who works in or around prisons in the UK know that, compared certainly with some other jurisdictions, they're relatively well run and relatively safe compared to a number of prisons in other jurisdictions. But, it's really important that we're not complacent or just overly congratulatory. And there's definitely some really, disturbing practices that go on in prisons and have done so in the past and in the present, and I fear in the future. And I just think that, what happened to Zahid Mubarak was kind of a terrible moment, obviously for his family and for Zahid Mubarak and for the wider prison system, and kind of in one sense, the kind of thing that happens and is really, really disturbing, that, in a modern society that kind of likes to think that it's guided by values of, decency and respect and human rights. These kinds of things happen, in state care, which is what prisons are.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for that opening kind of summary, really, of a really kind of complex set of issues. And we will come back to that. Before we do, I can just see there's a question that's coming up here on the Q&A. May I ask how you feel about Zahid Mubarak's death being used as a case study when teaching criminology? I have always tried to impress upon students that he was a young person with his whole life ahead of him. Encouraging level of empathy for Zahid has opened a door to understanding justice for many students I have taught. Do you have any immediate reflections on that?
Yeah, all I just said, I think it's really important to us as a family and as a trust that this case is still taught, and the young people, especially the new generation, is taught about this important case. I strongly believe that the past informs future. And if there is any ways we can help you, please get in touch, and we will be more than happy to come along and also kind of contribute to your case studies.
And I guess in relation to, because the questioner puts case study in scare quotes, and I suppose maybe part of it, it's implied there's a difference between telling someone's story and seeking to engage a new generation of students and activists and others in thinking about the implications of that. And in a rather kind of cold textbook sense, here's the case study.
Yes.
That someone learned, as it were, by rote to illustrate a particular problem. And then the person behind the story almost can be at risk of being almost incidental, because they just represent a case study rather than being a person with their own history.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the existence of trust is important. And when people who are murdered or had tragic deaths become just numbers and they just fill the case studies, organizations who still carry on, I think can provide really important kind of a live statement and testimony of what that meant for family, what that still means. So that's why the work of the charities who still carry on following these tragic deaths is very important.
Thank you. All right, we're going to come back to talk a bit more about the current work that the Zahid Mubarak Trust does in a bit. But before that, we're going to move on to somewhere else, indeed, go back in time. Khatuna, you grew up in Georgia, this is the former, I never know how to describe it to make sure people realize we're not talking about in the United States. So the former Soviet Republic, it's probably actually not a very good way of describing it these days, Central European Republic maybe. And some of your early work, you worked as a freelance journalist at one point, but you were also the executive director of an organization that still exists now. It's called the Union 21st Century. So how did you get involved? And it's a kind of a human rights, it works in the areas of human rights, doesn't it? And
yes.
So yes. How did you get involved in the work of the Union 21st Century?
Yeah, so I'm going to start a little bit about journalists, because I did dedicate solid 6 years studying journalism and media studies. And I guess for me, to get involved in journalism, it started as a childhood dream. And I had no idea in the 90s that there was such world as an NGO sector, which is whole new world on its own. I guess I saw journalists as powerful individuals who have voice and the platform to influence change. I was in love with investigative journalism. To be honest, I still am. How can you not admire people who risk their lives to expose corruption and human rights violation and brandishing truth? So this was the area I was particularly fascinated with, investigative journalism, and as I said, I dedicated solid a few years of studying the subject. And I imagine I would have stayed if not the NGO world. Very first youth organization I got involved was in 1998, and it's been 24 years and still counting for working for the sector. So in terms of how I've got into human rights, it also started with interfaith work. Georgia is a fascinating ancient country. I'm gonna use this platform to promote. If you have not visited it, please do. Georgia has adopted Christianity nearly 2 centuries before England. It's one of the oldest countries and is predominantly, understandably, a Christian country. I think about 80% of general population identifies as such. Over 22 years ago, when I got involved in interfaith work, I believe the percentage was much higher, so about 90% and over 90% of population identified as such. And Georgia is a curious case when it comes to freedom of religion, because it is a secular state with recognition of the spatial role of the Orthodox Church of Georgia in the history. And in the context of dominant religions in secular countries, it is not unusual that the de facto and the jure state of freedom of religion are often different things. For example, although Georgian constitution provides freedom of religion and the government generally respects this right in practice to some extent, there are glaring inequalities when it comes to practicalities such as, for example, building places of worship, financial support from the state, and so on. By late 90s, physical violence and direct discrimination against non-traditional religious groups, and I mean anybody who really was not Orthodox Church member, were regularly, it was a regular occurrence and was quite disturbing for anybody who cared for human dignity and justice, which I did, and gradually my sense of solidarity with them became my human rights work. We did some extraordinary work facilitating dialogue between religious leaders, sharing international practice of church-state relations in the Western countries. And I believe much of this fantastic work we did laid the foundation for the current initiatives the organization carries very well up to now. And in parallel to this, I've got involved in interfaith work internationally. It was interesting, an eye-opening experience for me. And as a young activist, I've learned a lot about how toxic it can be when politics and religion mix with each other. Hence why I left and I've joined a different angle of human rights work, which is more kind of working for on behalf of the victims of human rights abuse. Yes, sorry.
No. I was just saying, and
I can talk ages about this, but
no,
it's
really striking. I think how that kind of, as it were, struggles around sort of religion and secularism. Which is obviously kind of a feature of this country, but in a very different way. But it doesn't mean there aren't some quite significant, kind of a challenges. Well, actually, Northern Ireland, actually, the exception to the rules are already very, very strongly kind of related to some kind of religious issues. But it's interesting how wherever you go in the world, there are always some kind of quite gnarly and challenging and difficult issues, which sometimes come down to questions of human rights and vulnerable populations and how they might feel vulnerable and targeted and the rest. You also mentioned in your earlier comment about investigative journalism and how you admire them partly because potentially risking your life to uncover things that maybe those in power don't want to be uncovered. And during your period of work with the Union 21st Century, you yourself faced threats.
And, yes, we did.
But you also did quite a lot of work related to the European Convention on Human Rights. See, very much in the media at the moment in this country, the government just today announcing their latest to try to undermine the convention. So tell us a little bit about that, the importance of the convention to the work you were doing, and kind of doing that really challenging work against the background of some real threats potentially to your own safety.
Yes. So in terms of European Convention of Human Rights and European Court of Human Rights, we did some great work, like a litigation work on behalf of the victims of human rights abuse. There are still cases which I still remember vividly. In 2009, for example, we conducted a large-scale monitoring of human rights violations against the population living nearby to the conflict zone following the Russian war against Georgia in August 2008. We produced a collective claim of 112 victims of Russian aggression and submitted it to the European Court of Human Rights. We did incredible work of working from the villages, which were near to the Russian occupied territories. I did my first BBC interview about the findings, which I was very proud of back then. And I'm delighted that this hard work of Georgian human rights organizations, so a long-awaited victory a year ago, after 12 years, when January 2021, the European Court of Human Rights announced its verdict on the interstate case brought by Georgia against Russia, holding Moscow responsible for breaching six articles of the European Convention of Human Rights. So I'm really proud of that one. So you can imagine that really played a significant role in what we were doing. And I will also touch briefly how that was related also to Zahid's case. But as we are speaking also in kind of the context of my Georgian experience, I want to touch, and I'm sure you are implying the All Different, All Equal campaign we did. So July 24th, 2007, we coordinated the Council of Europe's All Different, All Equal Diversity and Human Rights campaign, running at the time, I think, in over 27 countries. In human rights work, you can never pick and choose the issues you stand for in solidarity and the issues you kind of don't agree with for various reasons. And that has been my approach always, and that was my approach back then. So I could not imagine running a national campaign on diversity and inclusion without LGBT organizations being part of it and being involved on equal footing. So what we did was the right thing to do. So we invited one and only LGBT organization back then to be part of the planning group. And the preparation process was going well until the national paper reported the event as first gay pride in Georgia. We tried to explain what was happening and how this reporting distorted the reality, but the damage had already been done. And what had followed was a horrendous hate campaign against us as the organizers of the event, against the partner LGBT organization involved in the work, against our friends and families. And it still upsets me what we had to experience. It evolved into a political debate whether we were aligned with the then President Saakashvili, seen as a pro-Western, anti-Russian leader by his opposition. The culmination was the official statement from the influential Georgian Orthodox Church that our actions would lead to mass violence, as our event was seen as a provocation and seen as a kind of going against traditional values. So with the backing of populist politicians and the church, mob of thousands of people, including young people, which was very disheartening, were getting ready for physical attack to prevent us organizing a peaceful gathering, which had a real simple message that people are different and people are equal. So with such political and social pressures and condemnation from obviously mainstream media and international organizations, mainstream media and the church, we've decided to cancel the event. And obviously that was nothing at the time which international organizations, including Council of Europe, could do to protect us and to guarantee our safety. But it was most stressful time in my career, but the one I'm very proud of even now. I guess doing the right thing is not easy, and it feels like it's never easy to travel the road which is less traveled. But in the end, I believe it will make all the difference, and it is making all the difference, because there were kind of similar events people try to organize, and I hope it will make some difference in future.
And I mean, is that still, I mean, it's some years on now. So is that fracture, as it were, in Georgian society, is that still kind of an ongoing have things sort of calmed down? I suppose I'm trying to kind of figure the right phrasing here. I mean, if you were doing that kind of work now in Georgia, would it be much the same, or has society, as it were, moved on a bit? Was that, kind of a signal moment in that regard, or is it just the same old?
It is really interesting question, Richard, and that's something I always thought, because it's like it feels in the history, you kind of make one step forward, two steps backwards in everything which is seen as innovative and new. I guess in some sense, it is probably safe to be a gay person in the central part of Georgia, maybe in the capital city, but I don't think it will be safe everywhere. So I do believe, despite of the progress made since then, there is still a lot of work to do. And if I will be there now, I will be absolutely carrying on that legacy and doing it even harder, because of my 27 experience.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, great. And I think it sounds like, they could, do with as many people that kind of experience as possible. And it strikes me, one of the things at the centre we sort of wrestle with quite a lot is, how do you foster meaningful change, which is more than just kind of the appearance of change, but nothing really changes, And, the role of conflict in there, I think, a lot of people quite understandably want to avoid conflict. We don't want to have a kind of a, sharp division of opinion. But it kind of, I just wonder sometimes, and that the example that you gave being a case in point, where sometimes you have to push things in order to hopefully go 2 steps forward, even if you're only going 1 step back. Sometimes if you, just kind of hedge around too much and you're not prepared to, to kind of, as it were, push particular points and particularly take a stand, including, encouraging quite a strong reaction, maybe progress is more difficult to achieve. I don't know. Is that?
It is. And I guess it comes down also what you asked me about in relation to European Court of Human Rights and European Convention of Human Rights. These are the mechanisms we used. These are the mechanisms a lot of human rights workers are using across the world. And it just really set day in terms of kind of UK now going to the direction it's going. It's interesting because I find it really interesting that the people, I met with one individual who was overly enthusiastic critic of the European Court of Human Rights, and did not even know the difference, that it's not actually European EU institution, or the European Convention of Human Rights is not the EU document, and goes to show how important it is to be well informed during this critical time for our future. In terms of in the importance of the case, I'm not sure if we have got time now, but for example, Human Rights Act was successfully used in Zahid Mubarak's case, and secured us what we achieved, and it is hugely significant for human rights in this country in the many years to come.
So just tell us a little bit about that, the role of the Human Rights Act and therefore the European Convention in Zahid Mubarak's case. What was the?
Yeah. So, but as you know, Human Rights Act has been absolutely key to the big justice fights over the last 20 years or so, including the Zahid Mubarak case. The Mubarak family fought for an independent inquiry. As I mentioned before, it wasn't granted initially, and it was on the basis of using the Human Rights Act under the right to life, which is Article 2, to investigate deaths where the state might be implicated. A court found in the family's favor that the investigations surrounding Zahid's death were not sufficient to meet the standards required by the right to life under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. So in a way, I don't know where we would be if that act was not there. So it was huge in terms of us securing public inquiry.
And I dare say, I might be doing them a great disservice, but I dare say that, you know, there's an application of international human rights law to a particular case here, and I dare say probably upset some people, you know, maybe in the prison service or in government, but probably now with the advantage of distance, everyone would agree, oh, it was a good thing that that finding was made, because it actually helped to move things on or not, you know, depending on your case. So again, that point about sometimes, you know, having to take on power and use international instruments, even though you know that government or public agencies are going to be annoyed about it or resistant to it, you know, you kind of need to sometimes, you know, break a few eggs to make an omelette, don't you?
Absolutely.
We're going to move on in a minute to just talking about the current work of the Trust and your work at the Trust. But before we do, I mean, during that period, you've also been doing other things. You worked, you know, with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. You worked in advised European Commission level. You mentioned the monitoring group. You had some association, indeed an ongoing association with the monitoring group, you know, then and now. But you also washed up in Columbia University in
Yes.
New York in around, I think, 2007. I mean, it's when I was looking at your kind of the list of various things you've done, it's a really kind of impressive, you know, really interesting and varied kind of experiences you've had. So what were you doing in New York at Columbia?
Thank you very much. I do feel ancient, Richard. So yeah, but all these were just, you know, magnificent experience for me. And I think I've been fortunate for being involved in the work I love. I absolutely love and enjoy. Human rights work is never really a job, to be honest. It's like a career, a long-term endeavor, something you build towards and work upon every day, something that does not start at 9 a.m. and finishes at 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. Not necessarily very healthy, but that's how it is. And that's why human rights workers enjoy what they are doing. It's all consuming area to be involved in. Yes, difficult, yes, exhausting, often unappreciated by the mainstream, but the rewards are invaluable. It indeed means a great deal to those who are oppressed to know that they are not alone, that there is someone who is fighting their corner, and that justice will be served sooner or later, even after we are gone. So I don't think that you get quite the same satisfaction from many professional roles as you get from this type of work. And of course, there are some practical rewards, like the moment I was invited to speak at the UN about religious freedom in Georgia, being quite young. The moment I made the decision about the European Council of Europe campaign, which I mentioned already, the moments of getting support from the foreign ministers and ambassadors for the cause you are passionate about. So these are the moments that will stay forever with me and that make worthwhile everything I do. And this work also gave me a great opportunity to travel to 32 countries. And this was just before I turned 30. Meet some inspirational people, incredible people, learn a lot. And working with leading international organizations, you mentioned few, OSCE, Council of Europe, and European Commission, when they support your innovative projects and initiatives, that also shaped my work approaches now. And obviously, being a visiting scholar at Columbia University and having a professional development visit to the UK in 2007, where I've spent 3 months being placed at the monitoring group. These were part of those incredible opportunities, which all shaped my personality and who I am now.
But I mean, these opportunities didn't just kind of fall on your lap, as it were. I mean, I think already, you know, I mean, you mentioned, you know, traveling around meeting, you know, interesting people and inspirational people. And I kind of feel I'm talking to one right now. I mean, you sort of, you know, to make that decision about in Georgia about that big event that you'd had planned for a long time, and kind of think, well, actually, you know, we just kind of need to step back to live to fight another day, actually. But also to really kind of seek out those opportunities where you could have a real impact. You need to have quite a lot, I suspect, of inner resilience and drive to do that. And these things don't just, these kind of opportunities don't just drop on people's laps generally. You have to kind of partly create your luck and create those opportunities. So, really, really interesting, quite humbling. 32 countries. I mean, I don't think I've been to half that number actually. I'm somewhat older than you are, so there you go. I've got some catching up to do.
Well, it all stopped when I got settled with family, so yeah, then nothing exciting.
Let's move on to the Zahid Mubarak Trust, and there's a question in the Q&A which it's maybe a good place to start there. Start with this. Operationally, what does the Trust specifically do to ensure the fair and equitable treatment of Black and minority ethnic prisoners, and most importantly, an egregious death like Zahid's does not occur again? You've already started talking about, the importance of, but any thoughts on that question?
Yes. So, so what we do, we combine policy and grassroots work, and we believe doing our best in affecting change individually, collectively, and systematically. And it might not always be in this order, but that's the kind of levels we think we might get there, kind of a systemic changes. And the work we do and the projects we run are kind of targeting these different areas. I did mention earlier our external scrutiny and support project, which is running across 40 prisons, and we provide holistic, I guess, the approach. If a prison wants to reduce racial disparity in its establishment, the project can provide various tools. It contains about 8 different elements, and if they are implemented effectively, and if they are implemented it's kind of all together rather than kind of pick and choose out of these different 8 elements, we do believe it does have a positive impact, and some recent HMIP reports will be testimony of this, where they found improved outcomes for ethnic minority people. And big shout out to HMP Bedford here for taking on chin our project and criticism from external organization. The approach we take in terms of external scrutiny and support project, we don't accept funding from prisons or HMPPS or the government. So we want to maintain our financial independence to give confidence to people we work with and our service users. So that's the approach. And as I said, also the combination of the policy and grassroots work, it is quite unusual from charities, because usually you get one or the other, especially if you're talking about the small and specialist organizations, because it takes enormous time, energy, and resources from us. And if ZMT's brilliant staff members are attending today, they will agree with me that we do get exhausted by end of Friday. However, such mixed approach is hugely rewarding for us, because whilst the national policy work takes really long to get results, and the results are getting smaller and you have to wait longer, grassroots work enables us to affect positive change much quicker, because you work with and you identify committed governors, you identify committed staff at local, like a prison-based. And also we work with individuals, we work with prisoners and staff extensively. As we usually make fun, like, we do spend more time in prisons when we spend in the fresh air. So that's where I guess our success lies really, and that will be our strategic approach in going forward. Kind of combine both and trying to make change at different levels.
And how does, you're kind of working in some really challenging areas, in this country, and hopefully not receiving, death threats, but I suspect at times some quite strong pushback, from a variety of different areas. how does, I mean, it's kind of just, this question just struck me as you were talking, you know, that how does your experience working with colleagues at the Zahid Mubarak Trust and dealing with the issues that you deal with, how does that compare with the work that you were doing back in Georgia, you know, where, I mean, very different context,
Yes,
but I imagine some
absolutely.
similarities in some ways.
Yes, I guess you could say so. Obviously, UK, you don't get that at all. If there are death threats, there will be a proper response from law enforcement agencies, which you don't necessarily expect from Georgian law enforcement agencies, for example, depending on what kind of political affiliation you might have. So obviously that's different kind of levels of challenges. However, I've never been racially abused in Georgia, which I was whilst living here. And I guess it's also, it's a kind of racial justice and racial disparity in prisons. It's always controversial and difficult issue. And you kind of expect that there will be pushback. You expect that you will kind of feel lonely in this space. And you already accept that that's not the job which will be getting you rewards every day and recognition. So you kind of carry on just doing it. And then if you get anything, any recognition or any support, you just take it, not granted, but you appreciate that.
Yeah. And you mentioned racial justice there. And I mean, one of the things I find really sort of fascinating about the Zahid Mubarak Trust as an organization is it kind of, as it were, intersects with a number of different worlds and a number of different fields of operation, you know. So it's a trust that was effectively set up by family members, you know, and that's relatively unusual. I mean, there are other examples, you know, the trust that was set up you know, to take forward the, you know, the kind of the you know, Stephen Lawrence merger and the experience of that is another example of that. But there are not that many. You work in the field of racial justice, but you're not, as it were, a kind of a mainstream racial justice organization. I don't mean that as a, you know, I mean, you're kind of, you have quite a specific focus, and you work in the field of, you know, prisons, criminal justice, but you're certainly not a conventional criminal justice reform organization. So you occupy a really kind of interesting space within this sort of, you know, within civil society. And I just kind of wonder how, you know, looking at it from the standpoint of the trust, how you see yourself in relation to, you know, so particularly the racial justice movement and the criminal justice reform movement. Do you kind of see yourself as part of both, partisan of neither, you know, kind of situated between them? How do you?
It's a really good question, and I think it's really important. I've obviously reflected on this when I took co-director's role, that very, very few charities took on the role of, especially led by families, of overseeing the implementation of recommendations from their public inquiries. I think we were the only ones in this space, because usually the charities would, or the families would accept it, that there is a commitment from government to implement the recommendations, and you kind of leave it there. However, the way we look at this is that's, I guess, where the work really starts, because implementation is not just accepting, you know, recommendations or making a commitment. It's about what you do in practice, and we wanted to be part of that practical work. And I guess, where do we see us? Yes, there are, like, I guess, two worlds of racial justice, much bigger movement, and then prison reform kind of organizations and sector. We never thought anyway kind of fitting in any of these. I guess, given that we carry on a niche work, which sometimes can be disadvantageous for us, funding wise, for example, or getting support, we could be very useful ally for any of this sector, really. And I guess that naturally we would align with kind of wider prison reform work, but at the same time, everything we do is about racial justice, but it is racial justice in prisons, because it always has been our priority. We do what we say on the tin we do, and it will remain our priority. Racial justice in prisons is a long existing and persisting issue. And even throughout the last 2 decades we've been around, we have seen it coming on and off the agenda for stakeholders. And my fear is that we kind of got used to it, like we accepted this as a normality, which you kind of expect this from politicians, but I've seen it creeping over in the NGO sector too. Like, we don't get collectively angry about collective experiences of injustice. Most of the time it feels, as I said, it feels like a lonely space to be in, but doing racial justice work, especially in the prison context, as I said, you kind of accept this, that's what it is. And you accept that there will be reports, there will be times in the history when some significant reports are published and your work comes to surface and becomes more visible, like as it was during Keith's report in 2006, when it was much easier to do advocacy work on race in prisons because everyone wanted to get involved. Same during the Lamy review. And I can think about other reviews, but it's much harder at the moment. And I don't know where this trajectory is going, to be honest. And instead of working towards, I guess, progressing the cause, we might be at the moment just having the position, holding the line and keeping the focus, and to make sure that we refresh collective memory, not only the criminal justice agencies, but also collective memory of the sector, why the racial equality matters. And it will be both. It will be racial justice sector as well as prison reform space.
So what you're saying is just kind of prompting so many thoughts and questions in my mind. And, generally with these discussions, I kind of have a little bit of not a script, but just a bit of a set of prompting questions to keep us moving forward. And I kind of always, kind of feel that there are so many more interesting questions to ask and just reflect on. But we'll come back to some. There are a couple of things I'd like to come on to, but just staying with that observation you made about, it feels quite difficult at the moment to do this work. And I guess, as playing devil's advocate, one could say, well, shouldn't it be the opposite? I mean, we had, the Black Lives Matter, that matters movement, which international movement really, but certainly particularly in the States and in the UK, and, what feels to some like quite a vibrant movement for justice. There's a lot of interest, in, let's say, fields of academia and study about, the so-called decolonize movement. We had the demonstrations in Bristol last year with Edward Colson's statue, ditched in the harbour. And certainly if one talks to, people in the prison service and others, they quite often talk about the work they're doing to tackle racism and race equality stuff. So it's really interesting that you say that it kind of feels like a really difficult time to do this work at the moment. And I take the point about it, maybe it feels less voguish, certainly in relation to Zahid Mubarak's story than perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. So why do you feel it's kind of really a more difficult time to do this work now? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I guess you could look at this from 2 points of view. So it could be obviously the much kind of wider context, but also you did mention, like, obviously since George Floyd's killing, it definitely has become an issue which people became more aware of, and a lot of really good work is going on. But surprisingly, that work has not penetrated prison system as much as it was expected. And I think that's the part which should be very mindful of, because that movement raised expectations hugely, and the reality did not deliver. And that can be very dangerous usually when you've raised somebody's expectation that things will change, and it does not. So I think that's what happened for various reasons. And I think it's down to resources, I'll be honest with you, in prison context. It's kind of stopped at the prison gate. So it did not have as much and as much impact as we wished for, or the prisoners and families wish for. And I'm sure the staff who really wanted to get more practical support. So it's a very complex, and I guess it frustrates me sometimes that I have to explain this even the people coming from ethnic minority groups, why it is important to keep focus on prisons. When we have debate around wider criminal justice system, because having a less focus on prisons, just because you don't see things, what's going on, and your only source of information is HMIP report and IMB report occasionally, it does not mean that what happens there does not impact everything else. And it kind of feels like people still did not get it. And you just need to kind of bring this argument back that, yeah, it's really important to keep the same level of focus on prisons, because with focus comes resources and comes hope. And at the moment, all of this is lacking.
And it's kind of really interesting set of reflections there. And in the last edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice, we were talking a little bit about the inertia in the prison system. You know, there's almost a cliche now, well, COVID and lockdown has changed everything. People are, well, you know, I'm broadcasting here from home. I think you're at home at the moment. You know, probably quite a lot of people are joining us from home, and not just because of the train strike, but because of changed patterns of working. Yet prisons, nothing really seems to have changed. I mean, indeed, the only thing that seems to have changed is that prisoners are in their cells for even longer, you know, during over a 24-hour period than they were before lockdown in many cases. And so I guess part of what you're saying there, and kind of in a sense reflecting back in a far less eloquent way to the way that you've just explained it, that, you know, prisons are, as institutions, for all sorts of reasons, it's nothing personal about the staff, deeply resistant to anything approaching transformative or systemic change. You know, there's something about the deep inertia in the prison system, and this is, you know, true across a range of areas, no doubt including in areas of racial justice and wider equalities issues. And it kind of poses, I think, you know, another question, one that you know, it's just worth very quickly exploring, which is, how do you, you know, the kind of a conventional way, I suppose, of thinking about how do we deal with, you know, an issue of racial justice? Well, one of the things we need to do is we need to catch racists and we need to prosecute them and lock them up. And my sense is that the Zahid Mubarak Trust is not particularly in favour of lots of imprisonment, you know, or lots of punishment and lots of policing in that sense. So how do you kind of square that circle of kind of trying to have a sort of transformative vision that feels big enough to actually make a difference, but doesn't kind of, as it were, fall into fairly conventional patterns of thinking about how you achieve change?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's really like $1 million question, really, which I would love our sector to have a bit of thinking about. I always said that I would not necessarily send a person who abuses me racially to prison, because I don't believe it will achieve anything. Firstly, because there won't be any effective program which will address their racially aggravated offense, for example, that element. And at the same, also I believe in restorative justice. Like, I'd rather have the opportunity to meet with a person, to have the opportunity to talk to them, and change his mind, or their mind, their heart and mind. So I believe that's probably is more effective. Obviously, there is a different levels of what happens in terms of violence, racial violence and crime, and that might not be the answer all the time, but there are certainly the crimes which doesn't require people to be in prison. And that's what we believe in, that's what I believe in. And in terms of, I guess I did mention already, I'd love the sector to think about this. And I really strongly believe in collective thinking and action. I think we need to have a safe space for doing this, like to have a safe space for thinking and to plan collective action. some kind of a respectful space where we, as human rights advocates, and to be honest, that's what prison reformers and racial justice workers essentially are, because it's all about human rights. And we need to draw the line on what we are ready to accept, how much expansion of the prison estate we should accept, how much overcrowding is too much, how much racial justice disparity is too much. It is increasing even since the publication of the Lamy Review. So I guess there should be a much wider conversation for the sector and collective thinking where we draw the line. And I, unfortunately, have not seen this so far, but diamonds are made under pressure. So I imagine maybe these difficult times will trigger some of these conversations.
And do you think, I mean, there's a number of organisations obviously do some really excellent work in and around prisons who do receive funding from the prison service or from the Ministry of Justice. So it's not in any way having a go at any organisations that receive funding. It's a really difficult environment to work in at the moment. Do you kind of feel for the Zahid Mubarak Trust, your position that you don't receive funding or you don't accept funding from prisons and from government? Is that kind of very important to you in relation of your sense of, as a way of maintaining a capacity for independent, not worrying about, can't upset that person because, we've got a big renegotiation of our block grant going through at the moment. Is it important for you that you don't receive funding from government or prison service?
It is, and I guess that's because the element of work we do, external scrutiny, it cannot be paid for by the organizations you scrutinize. That's what prisoners are telling us, their families are telling us. So that's really important for us, because it's what people are telling us we work for and we work with and we work. And I guess that's also really important for our integrity, because we made this decision, and however difficult it is, and not necessarily the great business case, you have to stick with it because you need to have some values which you would not compromise.
We're almost out of time. Let's just quickly pick up a couple of comments. There's one here. Do you feel this relates, interesting conversation, thinks it relates to the previous part of the discussion about how language, ignorance and populist media also leads to isolate people and therefore further othering occurs? And I just wonder whether, just looking ahead and drawing on, again, the experience that you obviously yourself had from quite a lot of ignorance and populist media, how you feel that's shaped your work, and perhaps also see if you can segue also into any advice that you might have for anybody maybe at an earlier stage in their career, or indeed looking for a career change, about advice you might have for them about how they might go around doing the kind of work that you do.
Yes, it absolutely does. So any kind of populist ideas, media, politics, obviously has a detrimental impact on human rights work. And as I've said, I believe our work falls within that context. And I do want next generation of activists not to be afraid of it. I do have some wish lists for future activists as well. For example, I want them to prioritize networking and collaboration with like-minded people in organizations. Because one man or woman or one person could never carry the same amount of load as two do. I also want them to make it all about their cause, not about themselves or their organizations. I do understand competitions and egos to come into this, and they've prevented previously many great ideas from flourishing. So be mindful of that. And lastly, I also mentioned kind of briefly about when you come to this space, for me, it's really important that you know the history, as history is really important for defining what you do, and do your homework. I sometimes call it a literature review, which we spoke previously about. So respect the ones who paved the path before you, however small or irrelevant they might be. And to be honest, I will be surprised if anyone will find any past racial justice work irrelevant, as we mostly repeat and rebrand what artists have done and or attempted to do. And just be mindful that the learning about the past will also help with innovation and making less mistakes. So it always informs future.
Khatuna, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. There are such wise words on the Q&A. I want to finish with a comment by one of the other comments in the Q&A, and I think the person here puts it so much better than I would. Khatuna, it has been fascinating hearing from you and learning about the scope of your experiences. Richard talked about the intersections between your history and the current work you do. You are proof that the NGO sector is rich with talent. Your work is incredibly important. And I couldn't put that better myself. So thank you, Helen, for that comment. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, is the last of our current series of Lunch With. So we're going to take a bit of a break over the summer. But we are going to ask everybody who's attended any of these Lunch With programs to share their thoughts with us, what we can improve, what you've liked about the program, any suggestions for people who you think you would like to us to have lunch with as well. And we'll be sending an email out in the next few days asking for your feedback. And it'll be really helpful for us as we think about the next series of programs. So all it leaves me to say is thank you so much to Khatuna for your wonderful contribution. Thanks for all of those who attended today, and thanks to those who gave a donation when registering. It's not, I know lots of people aren't able to do so, and we always make these events free because it's important as part of our mission as an educational charity, but they also they're not costless. So I really appreciate the donations that we receive to help us organise these programs. So thank you very much, and I hope to see many of you later this year when we hope to come back with a new series of Lunch With. And thank you all for now. Goodbye.